Good evening. Hello, everybody. As you can tell, I have the best job and the best bosses. Thank you for being here tonight. I have the enormous honor of introducing our esteemed speaker, but also an edict to keep my remarks short so we can get to the best part of the evening. And I'm not talking about cocktails. This is actually not an easy feat because Sally Mann has racked up so many awards and accolades, from Time magazine calling her America's best photographer to winning the prestigious Prix Pictet, that I could be here all night reciting them, and nobody wants that. But for more than 40 years and across an impressive range of exhibitions and books, Sally Mann has plumbed and probed the possibilities of photography to make art that speaks to what it means to be human. Her pictures are grounded in the intimate and the material, and yet they are infused with metaphor, emotion, and meaning. And moreover, she is unafraid to tackle the big subjects: family, land, history, race, nation, love, loss, and death. She takes on all the things. And as an illustration of just how unfairly talent is distributed among us, she is, as it turns out, an equally extraordinary writer. Like Bo Jackson and Michael Jordan, Sally is a multi-sport great, as creative and dedicated and dazzling as an author as she is as a photographer. Now, this should come as no surprise to anyone who has read her hilarious, moving, and introspective memoir, Hold Still, which was published in 2015. The brilliance and success of that book, which won the Carnegie Medal and was a National Book Award finalist, was the product of genius and creativity, to be sure, but also tenacity, drive, stubbornness, and a hell of a lot of hard work. And I think she would say the same about making photographs. And in fact, it's this question of work and of what it means to make artwork and what it means to be an artist that is the subject of her forthcoming book, from which she is reading tonight and which will be published in the fall of 2025. So please join me in welcoming Sally Mann to the stage.
You're my guinea pigs tonight, except for Amy, who is like right there somewhere. Nobody's heard this book, and I'm nervous as a kitten, so be kind to me. It's all new. If you have any editorial comments, fine. Just say them afterwards, okay? And be gentle. So this is the cover design for the book. We had some technical problems. We seem to be still having them, but they're mine, actually. There you go. We went through 13 pages of title suggestions, and we ended up with the simplest possible one, artwork. And by way of introduction to what this book is about, although I could faintly hear Sarah summarizing it, I'm going to read a few paragraphs from the beginning and then the end of the prologue, and it'll explain a little of what I'm doing here. Each chapter in the book begins with a quotation, and the prologue begins with this one from Ray Bradbury. "Get your work done. If that doesn't work, shut up and drink your gin." Prologue. This is a book about how to get shit done, or more particularly, how I got it done, or didn't. And I guess that's a big part of an artist's life, getting other shit done besides the shit you're supposed to be doing. The art, that is. We should get something straight right off the bat. When I use the word art to refer to the stuff I make, there are quotation marks around it in my mind. Other people most assuredly make art, but I've always hesitated to make that claim for myself. Asked by a stranger what I do, I have said, I'm a photographer for more than 50 years. Now I remember to say that I'm an artist. For one thing, I don't want to embarrass my highly esteemed gallery. And for another, it saves me from having to decline the well-meaning offers of work photographing weddings or babies. Not that I haven't done those things, and I'm not so proud that I wouldn't do them again if I had to. But explaining the kinds of pictures I take almost always elicits the, "Oh, so you're an artist," in a "why didn't you say so" tone of voice. So these days, I'm just cutting to the chase. And why not? Being an artist is not such a big deal. When you get right down to it, art is a job, a profession, not unlike being an insurance adjuster or a sportscaster. And it's not all that hard either. The writer Nell Zink once asserted that you could take the winos off the sidewalk in front of the drugstore and teach them to be poets in half an hour. And I had a friend who quipped that he could strap his iPhone on his cat and have a series of masterpieces by the end of the day. In a similar vein, Veronica Gang once wrote a mordant New Yorker piece in which several hostages play lifeboat to pass the time. Whom do you throw off? The nun, the pregnant woman, the majorette, or the artist Helen Frankenthaler? Throw off Frankenthaler, one of them said. What's art anyway? Somebody making a little something? So, like the drowned woman, I am just somebody making some little something. Many different little somethings, a lot of the time. And how many little somethings I have made over a long, long time perhaps qualifies me to write this book. So now then there's a blah, 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 blah. We skip to the end of the prologue. This book is written by an old woman, primarily for young artists and writers, with the vain and vainglorious hope that some of it will make a difference in the way you organize, yes, I did say organize, your creative practice, and that it may help you avoid some of the pits into which I fell, and fell deeply, I might add, wasting a lot of time, which, in this book, I will try to show isn't maybe all that bad, and also making some piss-poor art, which is not all that bad either, as long as you know the difference in the end. The end is where I am now, and I'm studying many of the artistic and life choices I made, scratching my befuddled gray head at why I chose one picture over another, or why a picture I now love got tossed in with the losers, and why on earth would I decide to live in Little Chicken Switch, as Cy called our sleepy little town, instead of a bustling art metropolis. Why writing weekly letters to a friend 3,000 miles away was important. And speaking of miles away, why would I tear myself from my farm, my darkroom, from my 9 dogs, for Christ's sake, to go across the globe to photograph an alien landscape that I knew absolutely nothing about? And what was I thinking, wearing rubber dime store flip-flops to New York City? Why does a stubborn woman keep taking the same damn picture 1,000 ways? These are some of the mistakes and decisions that I will write about here, the answers to which seem obvious to me now, at the end, or something very like the end. The chapter I'm going to read tonight begins with this quotation from W.C. Fields. If at first you don't succeed, try again, then quit. There's no point in being a damn fool about it. This is chapter 9, and it's titled Monkey on a Road Trip. And it alludes to things in the previous 8 chapters, so I haven't lost my mind when I spool off into other stuff. I sat down the other day with an AGFA photo box sharpied with DS on the orange top and pulled from it a dishevelment of maps, notes, travel books, and candy bar wrappers. It's been several decades since I began my series of photographs of the Deep South, and to get my bearings, I started by rereading the unpoetic and candid account I had written of the 3 road trips in the late 1990s. As I read, I pulled out and sequenced the hundreds of unsuccessful negatives that had been packed into the cabinets along with the other losers. Why do I insist on believing that every other working artist has it easier than me? That they are out there effortlessly producing good, new work while I am stuffing my cabinets with rejects? Or more to the point, that good work is inevitable at a certain stage in a career, that once you get past that hurdle, the good work minimum height requirement, from then on you will be buoyed by the inevitability of continued success. Just the fact that it took 3 arduous trips to eke out a few dozen good pictures undercuts that pernicious perception. It is assumed that each good picture, every resonant poem, each uncracked pot, eases the path for all the subsequent ones, that you get better as you go, not repeating the mistakes of the past and finding inspiration at every turn. But that is not always the case, and I include in these few pages of travel chronology some of the failed pictures that form a dense constellation around the stellar successes. Tucked within that Milky Way mass of clunkers is a perceptual phenomenon that possesses, at least for me, a potent force field that you may recognize from your own practice. Mercifully, this phenomenon comes into play when you can best accommodate it, like a tax tariff that only takes effect after a certain level of income. It was not until I was pretty far into my career that I first began to feel the effects. I'd taken some good pictures, mostly of people, some local women, the 12-year-olds, and my own children. And I had made editorial choices that were slanted in a certain direction, for better or worse, and had a career-defining trajectory that seemed immutable. The lessening of the gravitational power of the family work and the gradual seduction of the landscape sent me off into completely uncharted territory, but I eagerly harnessed up for the liftoff and immediately flew smack into the paradox of success. Dusting myself off, I discovered that what I had smacked into was the surprisingly, gratifyingly, solid edifice of my own past work. No matter how hard won or painful at the time of their production, by the time they were on the walls or on the pages of a book, my pictures had begun to take on the smug patina of predestination. They were now cocksure, with an incipient dignity, like an old rocker with a Brill cream ducktail whose sideburns are just beginning to gray. Where they were once transgressive, they now seem mainstream. Where they had required repeated attempts to tease out a success, filling me with frustration and uncertainty, they were now invested with a decisive Cartier-Bresson-like certitude. Just as we mothers are said to forget the pain of childbirth, it seemed I could no longer recall exactly how difficult it had been to make the old, established work, and now its self-confidence was subtly subverting my efforts to make new work. Because if I'm so good, why is this new work so damned hard all of a sudden? As a friend once remarked, you can always prove to yourself that good pictures are elusive, but you can never quite assuage yourself with the faith that they're also inevitable. Emphatically unassuaged, I set off for the unknown, south to the dark soil of the Mississippi Delta and the bruised skies of Louisiana, with modest faith in the certainty of good pictures, and, so the quip goes, much to be modest about. Below, I reproduce excerpts from the casual chronicle of my trips, written sometime afterwards, which eventually got condensed into the romantic Blue Highways account in Hold Still. I say condensed because during the writing of the Massey Lectures for Harvard, which I expanded into the book, I didn't take the time to dive deeply into that AGFA box of memorabilia and notes that would have revealed some of the minor, unromantic inconsistencies. What I wrote in Hold Still was not dishonest. Let's just say it was soft-focused, as if I'd put a diffusing nylon stocking under the lens of reality. And this brings me to another point. Retracing my travels through the South would have been so much easier if I'd saved my receipts, which I did for a long time. I saved every paper receipt from about 1972 until 1999, when, inexplicably, I decided that those were the very boxes to toss from my capacious attic, losing thereby all records of what photo paper and chemicals, now mostly extinct, I had used to make that early work, the sources of same, now long bankrupt, and germane to this, the itinerary and dates of my otherwise unremembered travels, traceable from gas station receipts. This inability to anticipate the importance of such ephemera springs, I suppose, from my abiding lack of confidence that it could ever matter enough to justify occupying what I thought of as valuable attic space. It was the same bone-deep disbelief that back then had me grabbing up test prints and using them to write letters on, as if simple stationery wasn't available to me. Notes to everyone, the paperboy who delivered my Washington Post, babysitters, the arresting officer for my speeding ticket, and most memorably, furious notes to critics. Great idea. Send them a candy cigarette, on the back of which you tell them to go fuck themselves, and that a strong letter will follow. All written on my own, now often valuable, prints. Not for a moment did I anticipate that they would ever be worth something to anyone. So deep was my insecurity. And now, of course, I seethe when I find the letters on eBay. You smart young artists probably already know that you're going to be famous one day and are prepared for it. Ted Orland describes an instructor struggling to teach the most basic aspects of the writer's craft to a class of as yet unpublished hopefuls who peppered her with questions about bidding wars, royalties, movie rights, and sequels. That cart is so far ahead of the horse, in this case, that the poor nag turns around and goes back to the stall. But perhaps you're right to anticipate. Fame has come to be expected and can be shockingly easy to come by these days. You, being children of the influencer age and entirely used to confidently asserting yourselves, will not be as unprepared as I was when the mantle of fame descends on you. I should have saved the receipts, is all. If paper still exists, you should too. Anyway, here are the notes from those travels, pretty much verbatim. Trip 1, April 9 through 19, 1998. Suburban, no collodion outfit in back, ortho and silver film, changing bag, use that a lot, no pistol. I was a little anxious about setting off on a road trip with just Virginia, age 13, for company, so when a friend of ours, Dave M., said he needed to go see his aunt in Baton Rouge, I asked if he wanted to go with us. He knew all those back Mississippi roads and liked to poke around. I proposed this first trip during Easter weekend for V, although it meant I was missing Jessie at George School Parents' Day. Emmett was at John Dewey and almost ready to graduate. Straight A's, healthy, beautiful, funny, and showing such emotional maturity, we had agreed to let him go on the class trip to London that same week, which seemed extravagant given the tuition we were paying for the place. It turned out to be a calamitously fateful moment, in certain ways defining the rest of his life, but we couldn't have known that at the time. Anyway, we strapped on the cow horns and left on Thursday, April 9th. I drove the first 5 hours, and then Dave and I switched at a gas station, and I mixed a gin and tonic, unwrapped my honey-sodden peanut butter sandwich, and kicked back in the passenger seat. We had all 10 James Lee Burke audiobooks featuring James Robichaux and Cleet Purcell, which I'd gotten through interlibrary loans and listened to every damn one. Loved the early ones with the original reader, Mark Hammer. New reader, Will Patton, not as good. Same thing happened to Louise Penny books. Their great narrator died halfway through the series. Anyway, stacked in the floorboards were all these big boxes of tapes, each one the size of a lunchbox. That's the way it was back then. At around 11 p.m., halfway through Heaven's Prisoners, we were closing in on Huntsville, Alabama. Dave was still driving, I was dozing, maybe there was a second gin and tonic involved, but was jolted awake when Dee skidded to a halt on a 2-lane road. The winds were bansheeing and the rain was horizontal. V, sleeping in the back, woke with a cry. We both were trying to be heard above the turboprop roar outside. The Suburban kept lurching forward in huge jolts, like a lunging horse, and I thought Dee was having a heart attack and stomping on the gas and then the brakes. He was gripping the steering wheel with a death-like clutch, and his face was straining in a demonic, teeth-baring rictus. I was panicked because I didn't know what to do about a heart attack. He didn't respond to any of my shouts, and the car was galumphing in giant leaps all over the road. First one side, then the other, lurching from ditch to ditch. Gradually, the wind's fury subsided enough so we could be heard over the noise. I shrieked at Dave, "You're having a heart attack!" And he tore at his death grip on the wheel. He was like a man who had grabbed a live electric wire and couldn't release it. By this time, the Suburban was canted into the ditch on the right side of the road. "No heart attack," he gasped, "a tornado." You know how you read about those cars that get lifted up and dropped in, say, a trailer park 10 miles away? That was nearly us. The 3,200-pound Suburban, packed to the headliners with people and equipment, had been repeatedly lifted off the ground as if being tested for flight worthiness by the tornado. Dave was rigid with fear and exhausted from wrestling the car from the roaring vortex. He had a lot of knowledge about tornadoes, having grown up in Mississippi, and a huge fear of them, therefore. Because I didn't have that experience, and because I didn't realize the dimensions of the danger, I wasn't quite as shook up as Dee until he began telling me how mortally close we had come to biting it in those moments. He said he had been within a second of telling V and me to roll down the windows and dive into the ditch by the side of the road, the winds being too powerful to open a door. Apparently, that would have been good advice, going for the ditch, if we could have gotten to it without being sucked up. We sat for a while and waited for things to calm down, then drove to a motel, not a chain motel, a little vestigial 2-lane highway motel. The next morning, when V and I came down to the lobby, Dave sat at a Formica table reading the local paper, which reported in 40-point bold type that 12 people had been killed by that tornado right where we had been. After breakfast, we soberly fired up the Suburban, appreciating its Leviathan qualities, as we drove through the branch-strewn roads, avoiding the down power lines, headed toward the Natchez Trace. We picked it up south of Cherokee, Alabama, and lumbered along at the speed limit. Mile after mile of boring forest. I was beginning to think that maybe the tornado had been an omen of some sort, pulled from the biblical grab bag to warn me off. I stared dully out the window at the sameness scrolling by, not likely to find a good picture here any time short of Elvis's return, although I hoped I might hasten that along by setting up the camera at the Chickasaw burial mounds that showed up from time to time. Waste of film. What was I doing down here anyway that I couldn't have been doing at home? Oh, right. Transporting Dee to his aunt. showing V the mighty M. At least there was some reason. After entirely enough time on the trace, we turned west, probably at Tupelo. Dee was keen on finding a graveyard where a Confederate relative had been buried, and my heart lifted at the prospect of romantically drooping, moss-draped branches and ancient lichen-covered tombstones. Who can't get a good picture in a cemetery? But no, hardly worth bringing out the camera. I was discouraged the second long day of this trip, and so far, 3 gas stations, a weed-covered hill, and Stalinist blocks of stone instead of tombstones. No moss, blazing sun, no gauzy atmospheric haze, regular old trees. Of course, since I was there and all, I hold out the camera and the heavy bag of film holders and went ahead and took some pictures in that scraggly-ass graveyard. And of course, I can't resist a good tree picture, which, looking at it now, I realize weirdly foreshadows the emblematic scarred tree of my third and final trip, when I guess I finally figured out how to take a good picture. Maybe if I'd been able to look ahead and see that good pictures were, in fact, in my future, I would have felt better. But at that point, I was just taking dumb pictures, and I knew it. But better dumb pictures than no pictures, I reasoned, as Dee wandered around, spitting on his shirt tail and rubbing the carvings for a better look, while V read Rebecca under the magnolias. But dumb pictures beg the question, why do I bother? I began to doubt the wisdom of the whole enterprise. I could have stayed home in Virginia. There are magnolias there, too. Packing up, we headed on down toward Oxford, where, on the outskirts, Dave pointed out a house he thought the Grishams had once lived in. It had since been wedding-cakily tricked out. I didn't photograph that, of course. So far, not a single good picture, not even close. After craning our necks for Atticus in the Oxford town square, we headed out to Faulkner's home, Rowan Oaks, where I was positive I would finally get a good picture. V took the house tour while I tried to find something to photograph. SOL. Just more scarred tree practice. Everybody had now joined me in the slough of despond. I announced there were no pictures anywhere in this godforsaken landscape. Needed to get to the river. Pissed at everybody. Everybody pissed at me. We loaded back on and pressed on southwesterly. Pea Ridge, Prophet Bridge, Eureka, if only. Then, appropriately, Dummy Line Road. From there to Bobo and across the Little Tallahatchie into Sumner, where my friends Maudie and Lang live in a great ancestral pile they call Grey Gardens South. Could be Evie Beale's winter home. When we gloomily disgorged at GGS, Lang made me a strong drink, and I began to feel better. After a while, Maudie, who I didn't know well at the time, swanned into the kitchen, cool, thin, and elegant in twill riding jodhpurs, the old-fashioned kind with a slight balloon at the thigh, and I delightedly asked, "Oh, do you ride?" She looked pityingly at me. They were Paris couture. Typical of trickster memory, based on Proustian imperatives of smell and taste, I can recall almost nothing about that visit except this. Lang produced a sizable pork loin roast seasoned with a Creole rub that he tied together like a pro, without consulting the directions, done it all his life, and roasted it. Superb red wine. No good pictures after 800 damn miles, but I almost felt okay about it. I was determined to get to the Mississippi, where I knew all the pictures would be. And maybe this is just another instance of an unyielding expectation that gets in the way of a manifold vision. Rather than actually looking out the window at the ravishing Delta landscape, I single-mindedly pursued the evocative riverine image I believed was mirage-like just over the horizon, stopping to pull out the camera only occasionally when a plaintive, mongrelly tree or some irresistible spectacle of kudzu would siren song me out of the suburban. When, a bit above Vicksburg, we finally spy the uninspiring Blousy, aptly named Big Muddy, behind some cottonwood trees fluttering with plastic Walmart bags, I was so disappointed and peeved that I didn't see the point of setting up the camera because I had raised such a stink about getting toot sweet to the river. I then made a show of taking a few pictures. Climbing back in the car, I wasn't going to argue with Dee's suggestion that we go to the Vicksburg battlefield, where I got exactly no good pictures either. Scowling dispiritedly at the wall carved with names of the dead, I imagined penknifing my own among them. I guess that's all you need to read or listen to of the self-pitying, Byronic despair in which I indulged for those first few travel days, because in truth it didn't get all that much better for a while. Susceptible as ever to opportunistic and self-indulgent sorrows, my spirit sank to a depth unplumbable by any line and took everyone else with them. I have wallowed in those depths many times before, even in the early years when ebullient optimism should have catapulted me back up into the oxygen. Here, for example, is a letter written to Ted in 1978, which pretty much could have been written yesterday. And I waste hundreds of sheets of film because 99% of the pictures I take are shitty. So I'm left with the hard fact that I don't know my ass from a hole in the ground from a photograph, and it's sheer luck that I get an image that's printable. Out of 1,500 images last year, I have 15 that are worth printing, maybe. I really do feel that I'm not great, that I'm mediocre, but not quite mediocre enough to ignore, that the well never exactly runs dry, but that it's shallow and has a listless flow. It's a terrible feeling. 1978. I still think the same way. Anyway, sorry. But I kept taking pictures. Perhaps the most important concept in that journal account of the trip south, and even in the 1978 letter, is that even though they were dumb pictures, and I knew they were, I kept taking them. Monkey at a typewriter. Sooner or later, there was going to be a good one. The monkey was going to get lucky, even if it was by accident, which in fact the first one was. A happy accident immediately after a bizarre encounter I now view as a portent, perhaps a tornado reversing portent. Having stopped by a muddy stream, red with bulldozed dirt from a subdivision, I heard the unmistakable chords of Beethoven's Pathétique. What the hell? Following the music to the open window of a fake plantation home, its unfinished portico held up by styrofoam columns, I discovered the source was the pianist Simone Dinnerstein, assisted by a man disfigured by leprosy. Feeling as though I was stepping out of a Fellini set, I tiptoed away and returned to the predictable, the suburban, my camera, the dumb pictures, like this one, taken right then. Not so great, right? Yeah, I know. And I took it not just once. 6 times I took this picture, or variants thereof. 8x10 film is not cheap, in case you wondered. But the old spendthrift monkey just pecks away. And guess what? A miracle. A miracle of incompetence. A sloppy chemical moment in the processing. Luck, in other words. Bad luck that turned into good luck for the monkey. What I feel about man's work is best summed up by that old saw. Give an ape a portable typewriter and it might come up with Moby Dick. Man uses expensive equipment, and if she shoots long enough and learns about cropping and composition and lighting and self-expression and, oh yes, subject selection, she might yet come up with a poor man's Ouija. This retired art teacher busted me and my simian process in his letter to the New York Times way back in 1992. His self-reported experience with photography, beginning in college in the 1940s and later as a photo teacher at a local boys' club, sharpened his eye for fakery in all forms. But he was wrong about the expensive equipment and dead wrong about Moby Dick. No monkeys, no matter how dexterous or numerous, could ever write Moby Dick, one of my favorite books. They'd be lucky just to get the title. And likewise, sometimes no amount of trying, no amount of good old stick-to-itiveness will get you a good picture. It pains me to say this, and it didn't happen all that often to me, but sometimes, in fact, you just have to give up. Like this damn dead duck I was obsessed with. My friends John and Leslie raised fowl of various kinds, slaughtering and freezing them. This was before I had chickens myself, and I was still charmed by their deranged chaos. And I knew that a chicken dust-up was virtually guaranteed if I brought feed and tossed it into the background of a picture with a kid in it. Bound to get something interesting. For one whole fall, I'd pick the kids up after school several days a week and go out to my friend's farm, where I'd set up the camera among the feathers, guano, and dusty scratchings, hoping I could get something good without anybody getting raked by a rooster's spur. One day when we arrived, Leslie had grabbed up a flapping, honking, dander-spewing duck and was holding it upside down by the yellow feet. We watched in fascination as she fed the head and long neck down an aluminum funnel-like contraption that was affixed to the fence post. As the duck was squeezed into the funnel, the flapping diminished, and pretty soon, out of the lower cone hole, emerged the beak and neck of the still squawking bird. One quick flick of Leslie's knife at the touchingly vulnerable throat, and the bird was silenced, blood pouring into the bucket below. By that time, of course, never one to miss the photographic opportunities at an execution, I had run back to the car, grabbed my camera, and had it set up at the ready. The kids were backing away, staring in horror and fascination as the yellow legs began to droop. Brightly, I inquired, "Who wants to be in this picture?" And 3 pale faces swiveled to me in disbelief. It ended up being Jessie, my brave girl, with Emmett willing to pay his part a safe distance away. In a notable supporting role here is the ex-carousel horse, which Leslie was only too happy to get out of her yard and which has made guest appearances in many of my pictures over the years, living now as a double amputee on my studio porch. For whatever reason, I didn't think the original picture was any good, although almost 40 years later, I rather like it. So I asked Leslie if the next time she was slaughtering, she would be willing to set aside a duck for me so I could try to reshoot the picture. She obliged, putting an exsanguinated carcass in the freezer so I could come get it any time for a repeat picture. Or as it happened, dozens of repeat pictures. I tried taking that damn duck picture so often that its wing feathers snapped and the jagged, hollow quills threatened to stab Leslie every time she reached into the freezer that winter. Even the indefatigable Jessie flagged. A few times I had to call in the understudies. Of course, I had to bring my own blood each time, having found the Caro syrup I tried the first few times unconvincing, and which I once hastily stuffed back into my camera bag, loosely capped, after dripping it onto the bucket, with a predictably bad result. At least it wasn't the jar of blood. As winter turned to spring, we were still ramming the rock-hard carcass into the cone, and likewise ramming this dumb idea into the dead end where it was clearly headed. Jessie put her foot down and asked for a reward, a red taffeta ball gown she had seen at the Stonewall Jackson Hospital thrift shop the week before. The afternoon we were to take our last trip to the Cone, I dashed to the thrift shop and grabbed it, standing across the table from the Pink Lady volunteer as she tucked the handful of dollars into a metal box and expertly rolled up the red dress in a spread of newspaper. No matter how briefly I was in that shop, I always seemed to run into one of our local nutters. You know how a small town loves its characters. Most memorably, once seen lugging 2 brown paper grocery bags full of cash from his sale of a Twombly painting he had kept behind his sofa for 40 years. And sure enough, he swaggered down the ramp, yelling his usual question, "Who's died? Anybody in my size?" This man had been the scourge of my young life, having fallen in love with my father, who was his medical doctor, and becoming enraged by the rebuff he received. It was doubtless a kind and courtly one, as befitted my father's non-judgmental personality, but a rebuff all the same. He then sued my father, saying he had fallen off the swivel stool used for examinations, and when that didn't work, he burst into the office and threatened my father with a gun. My Texan father was no stranger to guns and began concealing them in both the house and the office, and installed a warning buzzer beneath his secretary's desk at the office. I have a clear memory of his little Derringer once lying casually beside him as we ate dinner. But even with the gift of the red gown, this duck picture couldn't be saved. Not that it was Jesse's fault, mind you, it was 100% my fault. The more times I tried, the worse it got. In the end, the first picture was probably the best, just not good enough. Mila Sivo, my archival studies summer intern, who, as I write, is struggling through the boxes of negatives, reported to me last week that so far she has found some 58 negatives of dead duck pictures. I suppose that knowing when to stop is just as important as knowing when to push through, although perhaps it's only the difference between the unvanquished, determined monkey typist who happens to be stone blind and the equally tenacious seeing monkey who thinks he may discern a hidden pattern and attacks the keys in a frenzied search for it. So often I would feel there was a great picture just there, teasingly close, with skittish, floating elements, the insolent cast of an eye, the pert lip curl that simply needed to lock into their divinely determined slot. Those times I also stuck with it, most memorably and successfully with the picture of Emmett in the river I described taking in Hold Still. The first time I saw Jesse holding a candy cigarette, looking like something out of a 1920s Hollywood movie still, I knew there was a story there, and I began corralling the supporting elements for a picture that I built as carefully as a mason puts together a stone wall. I returned to it over and over again. Many boxes of candy cigarettes. Many annoyed extras. Jesse's friend Rachel, my mother, Emmett, and especially Virginia. And then the right keys were struck at the miraculous right time. MOBYDICK. I went to the Deep South 2 more times, despite that frustrating, minimally productive first trip, or because of it. If at first you don't succeed should be carved on my tombstone. And so that I could share in the sentiment he expressed on his, I should be buried next to Gustave Flaubert. He beat me to the best epitaph of all, and one that basically sums up my life as well. He stayed home and worked. I had gotten just enough good pictures on that first trip to make me believe that it was possible, if film factories worked overtime to make 8x10 triacs, and I used every existing sheet of it, to get a few more. To cover my ass, I took along my collodion darkroom for those times when it was too cheerfully sunny to get a picture that had the murky, crepuscular, bad mood I was after. I also packed my father's adorable Lilliputian Derringer, and I see now that my pre-travel notes suggest that I should learn to shoot. The gun is so tiny that Virginia was shooting it at age 5. But that doesn't mean that I couldn't have done some damage with it, as long as my assailant was a refrigerator no more than 10 feet away. For travel listening, I had rented more audiobooks, among them, fittingly, Moby Dick and Joseph Conrad's Heart of Darkness. The days were long and lonely. The distances, though not watery, were vast, and the social, racial, and historical complexities unavoidable. Call me Ishmael, I thought, kneeling in the back of the Suburban and banging my head as I folded the bedding, still damp with the night's sweat. Stepping outside into whatever skeezy campground, I would study the maps, which revealed an expanse of distressingly unlimited possibilities, and randomly chose the day's destination. My high school English teacher, Ray Goodlatte, once assigned a Wordsworth poem with a line about cloistered nuns not chafing at their confinement and hermits contentedly chilling in their cells. I might be misremembering this. Do hermits have cells? I thought it was caves. The point was that they accepted with equanimity the limitations imposed on them, which paradoxically encouraged their creativity, just as Wordsworth himself embraced the restrictions of the sonnet form in which he had chosen to write. Ray had asked the class what the Wordsworth poem meant to us, and we rebellious teenagers heaped scorn on the capitulation of the captives. We wanted freedom, no limits, no strictures, wide open creative territory. And indeed, that was the landscape I explored for years, promiscuously taking pictures of almost everything that crossed my path, just for the sake of seeing what it would look like in a photograph. And that is how it should be. Most creative people need a period, or a lifetime in some cases, of unfettered artistic exploration. But in my case, despite being an unregenerate rebel most of my young life, I began to feel what Wordsworth called the weight of liberty. Without quite realizing it, I began to give myself assignments, parameters within which to work, like using just one shutter speed or one lens, or only taking pictures that had chiffon in them, or limiting my subjects to the age of 12, or most memorably, insisting on hand-holding my large format view camera, making me the butt of jokes for years. For a personality like mine, best visually represented by the ball of boisterous scribble that floats above the head of a cartoon character, there was freedom in constriction. I once remarked that I would be happiest making work in an airplane bathroom rather than choosing among the insurmountable opportunities outside of it. Henry James, in the Aspirin Papers, describes this as that odd law which somehow always makes the minimum of valid suggestion serve the man of imagination better than the maximum. I was pleased sometime later to read that Frank Gehry, a man not known for his artistic restraint, once said that his hardest project was one in which the client said, "Just build whatever you want." And whatever I wanted, photographically, was right outside the Suburban those mornings, a lot of it. In fact, maybe too much of it. Rereading the notes I wrote on that first trip down south, I think the root cause of my fretfulness was option paralysis. I was trying to home in on just one thing. At the outset, the Mississippi River, which proved to be not the shimmering poetic subject I had hoped, while being presented with an array of anxiety-producing aesthetic possibilities. As Dave and Virginia sat patiently by the side of the road in those first travel days, I reverted to my original practice of indiscriminate shooting, which over the years I've found to be the best way to discover your true subject, and fast. It will draw you to it like a magnet. What I was drawn to irresistibly and ineluctably on each subsequent trip was the deep melancholy of the solitary. And believe you me, there's plenty of that down south. I had my subject: vine-covered sugar furnaces, an abandoned shotgun cabin surrounded by acres of cotton, a lightning-split remnant of the primeval forest that had been ripped from the rich soil of the Delta, one charred upright that was all that remained of a torched wooden church with, weirdly, a still glistening, greasily red tampon at its base. A wire-enclosed cemetery in the middle of goddamn nowhere. Always a cemetery. Always the souls of the dead. Always a reminder that the pain-haunted, cruelty-haunted soil on which I planted my tripod legs were groves of death, like the burial grounds of the enslaved that Conrad found along the Congo River. Eerily, I found the voice of Conrad speaking to me as I drove, and with one hand on the wheel, I scrawled out this quote on the title page of my Lonely Planet guide. It was the stillness of an implacable force brooding over an inscrutable intention. Good one. I had the brooding going, implacable and fierce, and God knows the intention was occasionally inscrutable. But as I traveled, it became clear I was taking the same picture over and over. It was that same tree, the one I took in the dead-end Magnolia Cemetery while I waited for Dave to conjure his walrus-mustached ancestor. The same one as the rowan oak cypress on that first day in Oxford. I shot tree after tree, screeching to a halt at the sight of a lone specimen, a grueling, camera-hauling mile across a newly tilled field, each picture almost right, but each one not quite the unassailably definitive picture, emblematic of both those travels and, metaphorically, the South itself. I've written before about the miraculous furnished house that was loaned to me at just about the time I thought I would lose my mind with what my father referred to as the loneliness of the long distance. He wrote that in his journal after he had spent 5 scary nights hoofing it on a jungle trail from Burma to Siam in 1937. My nights weren't necessarily scary, and after all, I had the Derringer. But damn if I wasn't ready to have a shower and sleep in a real bed. And who, of all people, had washed up that same day and in the same backwater of Louisiana as I had? The California photographer Richard Misrak, whom I had met when we were both instructors at the Ansel Adams workshops and who also worked with an 8x10 view camera, albeit in color. Once in the 90s, Richard had passed through Lexington, staying over with us a few days, and had marveled at the beauty of the area. When he suggested he might stay a few more days and take some pictures around my county, I bristled with possessiveness. This was my territory, my postage stamp, my Hale County, my own Yakanapa-Tapa County. He had no right to swoop in here from his territory, the Western Deserts, and start taking my pictures. It was partly in response to his visit, which Richard, sensing my defensiveness, graciously kept to a social one, that I began taking my own 8x10 pictures of my beautiful home territory. And yet here we both were, Richard and I, interlopers in the lifelong territory of the Mississippi photographers Maudie and Lang Clay, as well, of course, Maudie's uncle, Bill Eggleston. In my case, ripping them off, just as I had feared Richard was going to rip me off years before. Aesthetic territorialism, I guess. Richard and I spent the whole afternoon taking pictures together. Of all the lonely places I had been on this trip, most of which I had reasonably described as backwaters, there are few that answer so completely to that description as the dirt roads we drove that day. And I was glad I had Richard with me. That deep melancholy of the solitary gets a whole lot deeper and sometimes a whole lot scarier when you're alone. Here are my notes, again verbatim, from that day. We met at noon on the 28th, Jesse's birthday. I know we spent that whole afternoon shooting. I took tree with two streaks, several dusty roads, those bowed grasses. Nothing brilliant, but I can't say I didn't try. Richard wasn't shooting, except maybe some digital color, but was gracious and patient with me while I labored along, always thinking that this one would be it. And of course, it never was. I worked until night fell and the ground mist rose, which I also shot. But of course, all duds. We went back to the house, had many drinks, as we say. Richard is a lightweight, apparently. He staggered up the stairs by 9 in full woozitude. I stayed up a while longer to unload and reload film, a job I hate. It involves sitting legs splayed out on the bathroom floor, and I've been in some hotels whose floor you really don't want to sit on, and twisting my sticky arms into the elasticized holes of the changing tent where they heat up to about 200 degrees. My back hurts like hell, hunched over the armholes, my hips too. It takes a long time, and when the mosquitoes land on you and start their evening feast, you can do nothing about it or risk ruining the film. Good thing I'd had those gin and tonics. When I got up in the morning, there it was, right outside the back door, the barbed wire scarred tree in the fog, lifting fast. So glad I had taken the time before bed to reload my film holders. I was ready to go, quick, quick, quick. Grab camera, lenses, film holders, set up tripod, struggle with that stupid screw attachment, make all the decisions, which lens, which angle, how close, what's that damn thing on the fence behind the tree? Shit, shit, shit. Is it a plastic bag? Well, never mind. Better to get the picture before the fog lifts. So is it orthofilm or Tri-X? Okay, some of both. What's the exposure? Where is the light meter? Lost as usual. Well, I guess no. Oh, no, here it is. My old Weston meter from 1969. Who knows if it's even right? Should I take a chance with my funky ancient lens or use the lens with a shutter? But it sticks anyway, and really, is this light reading correct? Should I use incident or reflective when it's foggy like this? Decisions, decisions, decisions. I shot so many frames, my hands shaking with excitement, you'd think it was a Zapruder film I was making. It must have been entertaining for Richard watching this frantic, inept performance. He photographed the aftermath, the camera still set up, the sun shining in, the fog drifting across the film. Me, probably, collapsed inside with a washcloth over my forehead, feeling like I'd done a day's work. After a while, we went for a run. He peeled off, and I managed to gut out my 5 miles in some really serious Louisiana heat. At that point, I was pretty sure I might have gotten a good picture if I didn't screw it up unloading the film holders or developing the negative or by contriving some other way to ruin it. For a die-hard pessimist like me, that's a rare and exhilarating feeling, however ephemeral. When you get a good picture after taking so many that you know will end up with the other duds in the loser cabinet, the scene is charged for just that instant with a numinous shimmer, no longer commonplace, but instead alive with a transformative razzle-dazzle. I am far from spiritual, but I have experienced convincingly the ineffable magic by which obsession, frustration, repetition, and serendipity miraculously transfigure that thin Nabokovian slice of time, that tenth of a second, into something eternal. By the time Richard pulled out for his drive back to the airport, and I began packing my stuff for the rest of the trip, the sun was up and the scarred tree was just an ordinary tree, no shimmer, no razzle-dazzle magic, just a tree that had an unfortunate encounter with the great American scourge, barbed wire. I am a very lucky monkey. Thank you.